Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining in. We'll just start in a couple of minutes. Hi, everyone. Am I audible? Yes. Okay. Uh, okay. I'm Manogna and I work with the education and outreach team at MAP. Thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to welcome you all to this very exciting conversation with Dr. Mrinalini Sil. I'd also like to mention that this event is in conjunction with the exhibition titled The Forgotten Souvenir, which is currently displayed at the Infosys Gallery at MAP, which I invite you all to come visit if you haven't already. It features a wide range of mica paintings from Murshidabad, Patna, and Tirchi, which represent a nearly forgotten chapter in Indian art, bridging the gap between the decline of traditional miniature paintings and the advent of photography. To provide a little background about our guest today, Dr. Mrinalini is an art historian of early modern South Asia with an interest in Mughal and provincial Mughal paintings, patronage, the long 18th century, and the history of collecting. She has published and presented her work on Murshidabad paintings widely and has been part of the curatorial team of the exhibition titled Rajas, Nawabs, and Firangis, which features treasures from the French and Indian archives during the mid 18th and 19th centuries. Currently, she is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. We also have Khushi Bansal from the exhibitions team at MAP, who will be facilitating this conversation with Mrinalini. She works as a research curator and has curated the Forgotten Souvenir, amongst other extensive projects, including Museums Without Borders, which is a series wherein MAP collaborates with museums around the world to explore stylistic and artistic practices of different artworks which exist in these spaces.
How are you?
Today, Khushi and Mrinalini will look closely at the explorations, research, and role of mica paintings within the larger context of the company school. Uh, we also have Emma and Saurabh who will be interpreting today's session for us today. And without any further ado, I will let Khushi take over.
Thanks, Manogna. And welcome to everybody to this particular talk. We're really excited to be discussing a subject that's close to our hearts, which is going to be mica paintings, specifically in the context of Murshidabad. And a really big thank you to Mrinalini for joining us for this conversation today. Really looking forward to it and diving deep into the subject matter, really. So to just start things off, we thought that it would be interesting to start with the context of this particular talk, which is The Forgotten Souvenir, an exhibition that opened in November at MAP that delves into mica painting specifically. Typically, mica paintings have been clubbed under exhibitions that explore company school painting specifically. And so we thought by bringing it to the forefront, we're really exploring the lesser known histories. And it was interesting because for this particular exhibition, we had to largely rely on a lot of oral accounts, on a lot of travelogue entries by officers who were in India at the time. But again, it raises questions around patronage, it raises questions around materiality, around regions, and we're going to be covering all of that in our talk today, actually, and I'm really excited for it. So just to start things off, we'd like to show you a glimpse into the exhibition itself, which is on display at the museum. And essentially, it covers the three regions of mica paintings. We unfortunately did not have any from Benares, which is one of which it was the region in which these paintings were created. So we specifically look at Murshidabad, Patna, and Trichy in the south. Essentially, we can tell that the later examples of Murshidabad painting and the early Patna style of painting had a lot in common, which actually Mrinalini helped us with and helped us through. So we're really grateful for that. And the exhibition opens by laying the context as to what company school is, the context in which these paintings are being created, how there was a new patron, and how there were new aesthetics that were being adopted by artists in various regions of the country. And so we start seeing a stylistic shift. We start seeing a shift in themes, in color, in material. And so mica was one of those materials that was adopted at that point of time. And it was also used in Murshidabad previously, which we'll delve into in a bit. But essentially, mica is a very interesting mineral because it mimics European glass paintings because it's almost translucent. And in the image of the lamp at the bottom right corner, you'll be able to see how transparent it is in a sense. And it was easier to transport back to England specifically. And so it became a medium that artists adapted to and started creating works on. And we actually have a very interesting fan in our exhibition and collection, which basically looks at how the mineral was also adapted into different objects of use as well, in addition to paintings. And what is really interesting about mica, which I didn't know of before, was that there are actually 28 types to exist in the world. And while putting this exhibition together, we went on a little bit of a chemistry, we had a chemistry lesson because we were talking about the different compounds that create this particular mineral, the differentiations between each of its forms, and how it is also used within contemporary, like how it's used in a contemporary use. And so it's a little bit of a joke also at MAP that I dove a little bit too deep into the science aspect of it, and I would often say that it's a great insulator of heat. But essentially, we look at how the practice of mica painting shifted from Murshidabad to Patna, and we have a really large collection of faceless mica paintings in our collection, as we see on the left. And the backgrounds were sold separately, typically. And um, again, it raises a lot of questions because the kind of subject matters that are being depicted is very heavily based on professions, trades, and castes. And so that becomes a little bit of a looming question within the exhibition as well. And the backgrounds are sold separately, typically created on paper. And we don't unfortunately have any in our collection. So we got the reproduction rights from the VNA for this one. And it has this ghostly quality almost. And I'm like, it almost makes you think of how the Indians were viewed at that point of colonial scrutiny and change. And we really see how different professions and trades were adapted into these paintings and how like how the Indians were perceived at that particular point. And it's interesting because this exhibition is actually accompanied by a film by Amit Datta, which was it takes images from our collection essentially, and it's a film which talks about the mutiny and how that started kind of also changing the um, changing the senses of the time and the way that how the Indians were being viewed by the British and the societal and political changes that were reflected in these paintings as well. And we kind of intersperse a lot of artworks that were also created on paper to show how the same idea, the same theme, the same trade and profession was being depicted in different regions of the country as well. And it wasn't just restricted to mica, the mineral, which we found that a lot of states and a lot of places started using this as a mineral because they had relatively easy access to it. And so it became a question on about materiality, and we extensively dove into it within the exhibition itself. But that's just a little bit of an opening dialogue. We will be talking about a lot of these points as we delve into the conversation as well. So just to start things off, my first question to Mrinalini would actually be about Murshidabad and its patrons, because now we've discussed that we are looking at Murshidabad as a place where mica paintings were a little bit almost originated, and we see a changing patronage coming at that point of time because it shifted from the Nawabs to now the European officials in the region. So just a little bit about those paintings and how those started to shift as well.
Thank you so much, Khushi, and thank you to the MAP team, Abhirami, and I'm also really thankful to Arnika, my friend and colleague with whom I have shared my PhD journey, for inviting me to this conversation, which is a very interesting topic and rather neglected part of South Asian paintings history. To situate paintings in Murshidabad, um, first, we have to understand the political development of Murshidabad, which came about in the first quarter of the 18th century. And that was because of the disintegration of the imperial Mughal control in Delhi after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, which led to the rise of which led to the rise of the provinces which were under the Mughal Empire to break out and claim autonomy. So Murshidabad also was the province of Bengal under the uh, leadership of Murshid Quli Khan, was one of those provincial Mughal provinces that broke out of the rubric of the Mughal Empire and claimed itself to be an autonomous state. And that's where we can situate the Nizamat, or the Nawab's court of Bengal, with its capital in Murshidabad. So the disintegration of the Mughal imperial control had led to a very interesting phenomena whereby, since the Mughal atelier had a lot of artists, they started, and due to the lack of patronage from the Mughal Empire, they started disintegrating and migrating to this newly formed provinces like Bengal, like Awadh. Some moved towards the Rajasthani Rajput courts, and that brought about a migration of the styles of painting from the Mughal center to the periphery of the Mughal provinces. And Murshidabad, painting in Murshidabad also developed in a very similar manner. The painting that we have on the left is that of Nawab Murshid Quli Khan, who was the first Nawab of Murshidabad. It's a painting which kind of asserts his sovereignty, and that is shown by, if we see that he's placed in a very central axis to the painting, and there are red boats placed just over his head, the head of the Nawab, which basically claims his power over both land and water, thereby kind of amplifying his sovereignty on the entire province of Bengal. Clearly, you can see there's a migration of the imperial Mughal style in which was developed in the court of Murshidabad as well. But this style would also evolve during the course of the 18th century, and an example of that is on the right side of the painting, where we see it shows a court painting, a court setup, but it's spatially and schematically quite different from the painting on the left. This is a this is a this happened because of a kind of painting style that was evolving actually in Delhi under the patronage of the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah. So Muhammad Shah was this Mughal emperor who gave a lot of patronage to the arts, and painting kind of found a new rejuvenation and a new life under his chief of the atelier called Chitterman. And Chitterman developed this style of painting, which was very spatially broad, used a lot of muted colors, unlike the ones that we see on the left. It showed a very close coterie of courtiers, unlike the ones that we see in Pachahnama or in Akbarnama paintings, where it shows a much more full court. So, this influence also seeped into Murshidabad through the migrating artists who would travel from Delhi to Bengal in search of commission, in search of patronage. And this painting on the right shows the Nawab Ali Vardi Khan, and he is shown in a very Mughal format, with a falcon in his hand, with his imperial insignias, which all claims his power, his sovereignty as the rightful ruler of the province. And there was an attempt on the part of the Nawabs to also claim status which was not unlike the Mughals. During this time, we will also find that the Mughal emperors are being represented without a halo. They were devoid of the divine status. And the Nawabs are also being depicted in a very similar way. So, to answer your first question, Kushi, the first and most important patron of paintings that were flourishing in Murshidabad from the second quarter of the 18th century, it would be the court. It would be the court and the Nawabs. And that is exactly the canon which gave rise to the idea of the Murshidabad school of painting, which was associated with the court patronage. However, it comes with certain limitations, which I think we will discuss over the course of the
Yeah.
conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And with Murshidabad, like with the royal patronage, I think we see that starting to decline as well. And the Murshidabad school, as we know, it started to shift as well. And so my next question with this regard would be, how did British become the primary patrons to artists in the region? Um, and how did this idea of the company school, the umbrella term, which was only coined way later in the 20th century, come into use? And why, like, and the usage of the term itself, I think I would like to discuss a bit further because it minimizes a lot of painting traditions that also existed at that particular period of time.
So the canonization of the term Murshidabad school of painting is very intimately entwined with the idea of the Nawabi or the court patronage. If we look into the political circumstances of the period, the autonomous period of the Bengal Nawabs were quite short because after 1757, which is when the Battle of Plassey happened, the English became a very important political stakeholder in the region. That did not mean, however, that the court patronage dried up immediately. While more paintings are associated with an earlier period, that is prior to 1757, the court still continued to be a patron of the arts, of paintings, of illustrated manuscripts. But now we have other patrons coming in the form not just British, but European administrative officials who would be British, who would be French, and a motley of other people who were all in the political networks, this itinerant political network of European officials who would find job in different East India Company, in different positions, administrative, trading, mercantile. So the usage of the term company paintings has to be problematized when we use it in the context of Murshidabad paintings. For example, if we look into it, the painting on the left shows the Nawab Mir Qasim, who ascended the throne in 1760, seated in a small terrace setting, intimate court setting. This painting, and we know it's a very rare occurrence, but we know the name of the painter, is done by an artist called Deep Chand. The painting on the right shows a very European man who has been now identified as a Scottish surgeon under the English Administrative Service called Dr. William Fullerton. He's showed in a very Indianized way where he sits on the ground, he has a bolster, a rug, he has a hookah, which means that he had adapted to a very Indian way of life. He is attended by attendants who are quite similar to the ones that we see beside Meet Qasim. And there's a very small inscription at the bottom of this folio, which also identifies the artist of this folio as Deep Chand. So here we have an artist who is painting for the Nawabs of the court of Murshidabad as well as for European patrons who would commission him. This was a time when artists were what we can call as a very free agent, maybe something like a freelancer of today's time, where once they would just take up a work, which from whichever source, they were not tied to, say, a formalized atelier that was attached to a court like the Mughal artists were. So this makes the understanding of company paintings very difficult, because then can we classify the painting on the left as a court painting and the painting on the right as a company painting? It is the same artist. He's depicting the subjects in a very similar format. So that is why the use of the umbrella term of company paintings has to be problematized. To give a small background of how this term came to be used, um, it was coined by an archivist and later curator of the paintings and drawing section of the India Office Library of the British Library called Mildred sometime in the 1940s. And she associated it with the paintings that were commissioned by and for the European and in specific the English East India Company officials, for which the term company painting comes. She used it as a broad overarching term to kind of fill in a gap in Indian art historiography, because prior to that it was believed that there was this blind spot between after the end of decline of the Mughal Empire's imperial power in 1707, and the coming of photography and modern Indian art. So there was this 150 years of a blind spot. To kind of highlight that blind spot, she used this term, and it was used as more of a homogenizing idea to classify all paintings that were being done around this period who may or may not share stylistic features, and even even if the patrons were different, even if the provenance was different. So anywhere or everywhere that company had its presence and there was commissioning of art came to be included under the larger umbrella term of company paintings. But now I think with more scholars working on specific regions, working on different, not just the stylistic evolution of this painting, but on themes like the sociology of art production, where we look into patronage, circulation of painting, circulation of not just being the objects, but also that of the artists. We have more clues to unpack this term of company painting and nuance what is happening in the regions specifically. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you already touched upon the point that I wanted to discuss also, which is about the artists themselves. Do we know who these artists are? Because we often see that, like in mica paintings, we don't see it too much, but we have a really big painting which is attributed to Sevakram, for example, who is said to have migrated from Murshidabad to Patna through records, essentially. And so, just to know, and like with the history of Patna Kalam, we are able to trace families of artists who have been generational artists as well. And I'm just wondering, do we know who these artists in Murshidabad were at this particular time?
that's a very interesting question and something we need to delve in a little deeper. So, the first question that we need to address is why this shift from Murshidabad to Patna? Once again, we have to look into the larger historical context because it was in 1760 when Mir Qasim ascended the throne of Murshidabad to kind of reduce the British interference on the day-to-day governance because the British were getting very powerful at this point in time in post-Plasi Bengal. He had shifted his court from Murshidabad to a place called Mongaid, which is closer to Patna. And from Mongaid, it was so the artists also migrated along with the court from Murshidabad westward towards Mongaid and then towards Patna. So Patna had always been a very important entrepot of trade, and the British had important factories like that of opium and indigo, which would supply them with the raw goods for the trading. So obviously there was a significant presence of European and especially British officials in Patna, and the migration of the court just facilitated this movement. So this is the political event that stimulated the migration of the artists from Murshidabad to westwards towards Mongaid and then to Patna. In terms of artist biography, it's extremely difficult at this point in time to retrieve artist biographies because, just like I mentioned at the very onset, uh, they were very fluid. They were moving between courts and they were looking for commissions and patronage wherever they would find some. The idea of the formalized court, the formalized atelier, had kind of dispersed during this time. So the artists became free agents, they were itinerant, they were moving. And if we can go back to the previous slide, this is the artist Deep Chand is probably one of the only known artists, one of the two known artists who stayed in Murshidabad, worked for the Nawab, and then eventually moved westwards towards Patna and came under the employment of this English gentleman, Dr. William Fullerton, who directly commissioned paintings by Deepchand. Other than Deepchand, we know of another painter whose name has come to us through a inscription of a painting, whose name was Purannath. He used to be an imperial Mughal painter in the atelier of Muhammad Shah. Purannath, we know, had definitely moved eastwards towards Murshidabad. And after that, there is a conjecture that he had moved further and went to Lucknow, to Awadh. But to that, we do not have any concrete proof. So it's difficult to actually retrieve artist biographies, and Deepchand's name is one of the very few that comes to us. Since there's not a lot of written documents, it's difficult to confirm these movements. It's slightly more easier when they came into the employment of European officials. For example, when he came under the employment of William Fullerton, we find that the folios on the back, they're inscribed and the artist's name is also mentioned. A similar thing was also happening in Awadh. For example, so there was this general called Polier, Antoine Polier, who was commissioning an artist called Mirchand, and we get to know of this interaction because of the correspondences between the European official and the artists. For example, where he was giving out instructions of what to paint, how many how many folios did he want, what kind of paintings did he wanted made. So it is through these very sparse textual sources that we can sort of glean and garner a little bit about the artist and try and put together the artist's biographies um, like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we also found out when we were looking at the Patna Kalam as it came to be known, and how it largely relies on the oral accounts of Ishwari Prasad, who is believed to be the last living artist of the Patna Kalam. And we've touched upon how Patna became a trade hub essentially because there was this huge factory that was also set up in that region, which led to a lot of artists migrating to Patna at that point of time. But what were the social, cultural, political shifts that led to this as they moved from Murshidabad to Patna at that particular point in time?
So the main catalyst for this movement is patronage. Um, if we can go back to the last slide, no, the previous previous one. Yeah, thank you. So this is a painting which shows Alivardi Khan, who was the Nawab of Murshidabad, in a hunt, in a chase. Mm, technically, no one would classify this under company painting. But if we look into the small details of this painting, we'll find that the artist is trying to adapt to a European aesthetics, where they are incorporating formulas like that of the picturesque. And we are looking at a painting where the artist, who is trained in more of a Mughal style of painting, is abandoning things like birds bird's eye perspective, and now they are doing more of an aerial perspective. We are looking at a more receding background. These are elements which are getting incorporated in the artist's schema clearly from what we can assume that there were a lot of European prints that were in circulation during this time. They 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 had access to such prints, and maybe they were also getting directions from their patrons who were European, which led them to bring about certain stylistic changes in the ways they were painting. So, if we talk about the circumstances of this artist's moving or migrating from Murshidabad to Patna, I would say on the surface, it was just a normal move for them. It was just for patronage. But if we actually delve more deeply into the schema of the artists, that is quite changed. They had to adapt to European aesthetic requirement. They were adapting to European demands of how they wanted a painting, and even if they were painting things in a similar way to how they would do court paintings, there was a schematic change. And if we can move to the next slide, no, after this. Yeah. So they had to now depict common men in a similar way that they had previously depicted emperors, generals. So a common subject is accorded the same status, which is a huge schematic change in the way the artist's mentality is working when they are doing these different disparate kinds of drawings. So even if stylistically this looks quite similar to the painting that an artist must have been doing in the later half of the 18th century for the Nawab of the court, to him this was a paradigmatic change in his mentality, because they were not used to previously depict a layman, a common subject, the way they were depicting an emperor or a king or a general. So I think this is the main shift that occurs, this mental shift of how they were depicting the subject, which is of crucial importance when we understand European patronage of your Indian artists in this context.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you like I remembered this anecdote, which is an interaction with a visitor in the museum. And this person was talking about the Book of Gold exhibition and how each of the folios were replete with so many details. And then they walk into the mica exhibition and like these figures and forms that are being depicted, almost it's as minimal as it gets. So like for example, with even the couple of portraits that we'd seen earlier of company school examples from our collection. And so that like it's interesting to see how stylistically they also started to like shift focus from intricate detail. You can see changes in color, for example, because more muted colors are coming into play as well at this particular time. And that transition is very interesting because I think mica paintings stand out in that regard because they're very bright and vibrant compared to these examples.
Yeah.
Which actually makes me think about an argument that you posed in your thesis as well, which is Murshidabad paintings should essentially be renamed to paintings in Murshidabad. And the reason is, of course, we see that the same artists were adapting to different patrons, to different mediums and subject matters even, and it would traverse all of those things. And so just wanted to discuss this point a little bit further.
So, like I said at the very onset, the idea of a school of painting is a very teleological idea where there is a homogenizing effect, where we think like we are grouping together or classifying together things which look alike. And it is usually associated with a regional development. That is how we have Pahari school, we have Murshidabad school, Deccan school. While actually, if we unpack it, we find not just different strands of art making that were prevalent, there were different styles of art making which were contemporaneous to one another. So, just like you're saying, there are the court paintings, because, like I said, the court paintings did not cease to exist right after 1764 or 1765, after the Battle of Buxar, when the English East India Company assumed the Diwani of Bengal, because they still continued to illustrate manuscripts. They still continued to collect manuscripts and repaint on those manuscripts in the under the court patronage. Alongside, we have European patrons now. Then we have Jain merchants who were commissioning a completely different set of Jain religious manuscripts and Jain religious paintings from the same set of artists. And then we have very local forms of art like scroll painting or patachitra. If we move a few slides ahead, um, one more, another. Yeah, so this is also from 18th century Murshidabad. So clearly, there is no stylistic cohesion in the arts, in the different kind of painting that is coming from this place of Murshidabad. So it is erroneous to call it a school of painting which homogenizes all this, because they are not homogeneous, neither in style, nor in subject, nor in terms of patronage. It's as disparate as it can get. That's why the primary argument that I make through my thesis, which is kind of challenging the earlier work that has been done on Murshidabad painting, on Murshidabad School of Painting, is to talk about paintings in Murshidabad rather than canonizing them into something narrow like a school of painting. And another thing which is extremely important when we understand art production in places like Murshidabad and Patna during this period is the idea of art networks. Uh, Most of the paintings that we see today, including the mica paintings, were actually part of albums. The albums or murakka is something that Murshidabad and other 18th century provincial Mughal provinces gets from the idea of a Mughal murakka or a Mughal album. So these are almost always single page folio which are bound together in the album format. So they would have paintings from 18th century, they would have paintings from prior to 18th century, there would be Mughal paintings that would be brought into an album and all bind together. So this makes the study of something homogeneous even more challenging. And actually, in terms of company painting, and if we talk specifically about mica, I was very surprised actually. If we go a couple of slides back, another. Yeah, for example, these are two paintings on mica, as you will be able to identify from the translucent sheet on which it is done. It is actually part of an album that was collected by this French administrative official called Jean-Baptiste Gentil, who was functional in, who was operating in Bengal, in Murshidabad, and then moved on to Awadh. So the most of this painting being part of albums makes it even more difficult to be called as a school of painting, and that's why we have to look into them from different perspectives of materiality, of patronage, of circulation, how they were changing hands to have a more wholesome idea of paintings in Murshidabad.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next slide actually also shows an example of how they were often put into books as well.
Yeah.
So the one on the left, the two different booklets that we have, which are very small, and they just have 6 mica paintings put together on it with these little captions that run at the bottom, which was probably written by a European because the anglicization is also very evident in it.
Yeah.
And I think you also touched upon this previously, which is the whole documentation and research aspect of these paintings. And I was just wondering how the collecting practices of these new patrons impact the way we view these paintings within the context of today. Because a lot of them traveled out of India also, as we've seen. And what kind of omissions and distortions in these records do we actually start to see with regard to this?
That's a very interesting and a rather complicated question. So it again goes back to the idea of albums. This was also a time when the Europeans were trying to self fashion themselves, and they were emulating Mughal elite practices to assert their status and their significance in the society and over the people that they were trying to rule. Commissioning of art and collecting of albums was a very important cultural part of this self fashioning exercise that they would carry out. So, just like the Mughals commissioned Gulshan album, which is one of the most beautiful albums done for Jahangir, these Europeans would also commission albums. Now, not all of these albums were made from a same artist or from the same region. They would also be compiled of materials and paintings from different areas, different provinces where they may have served. It at times also, like I had just mentioned, they would also have older Europe Mughal folios, which would just amp up the status of the album. It would make it more precious. It would make it more important. This is once again very much embedded in the art network that was functioning. Um, Different administrators of different European companies, not just British, were actively collecting illustrated manuscripts and paintings during this time, just as they were also, if we look into the other side of the story, there was a William Jones who was founding Asiatic Society, and they were pursuing Oriental languages like Sanskrit and Persian. And the other end of it, in a more visual medium, was this rabid collecting of albums, of these albums of paintings, some patronage, some directly commissioned from artists that were in operation, and some just collected from circulating materials or materials which have existed and are known to be extremely of high quality from before. So naturally, most of these albums traveled back to Europe when the European agents went. Uh, Case in point would be Richard Johnson's collection, who was a very big collector, very big English collector who had spent time in Murshidabad and in Awadh in Lucknow. And today his collection actually forms the backbone of India Office Library's 18th century collections that we get to see. The other example would be for the French collection, we have someone like Jean-Baptiste Chanty, who was also, like I said, operational in all these centers. And today his collection forms, he had gifted his entire collection to the Emperor of France at that point, Louis XVI. And his entire collection today forms the backbone of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France's collection. So, like this, most of the albums made their way back to Europe when the agents went back. Now, what makes the study even more challenging is that the albums did not remain in their original format often. They were often taken apart, folios got dispersed, some were sold in the art market, some got acquired by other collectors. So the albums became dispersed, and this makes them studying them very difficult. Um, they are now spread across different collections in Europe. Maybe one or two can pop up sometime now in sales that happens. And museums, and then it was kind of feeding into the demand, the art market demand that was also there in Europe, where these albums often got kind of disintegrated, and the images had another new life of circulation back in Europe. Very few albums today retain the original format that in which they were initially bind. Actually, Gentil's album are some which have retained the format, although they have been restored, they have been rebind, which gives us an insight into how the logic of these albums operated. These albums were very malleable things where they would uh, have extra borders added, extra reworking done. So um, this is the core of how the objects again traveled back to Europe and is now today part of different European library and museum collections. But we often do not see them in the album format, but as loose folios.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's like I like to call it also this commercialization process that's happening at that point of time, and it's
Completely informed by the art market, which
yeah.
was as strongly operating in this provinces of the Mughal Empire in India during the 18th century, as it was in England, for
Yeah.
example, or in Paris. There were these art market nodes through which these albums and these folios would circulate
Yeah, and I
until
think
they reached Europe.
that's so fascinating, actually. And I think I have one final question for you before we open this up to the audiences as well, which is what drew you specifically to Murshidabad? And it's a three-part question, so I can repeat it later, but I will say it out and then we can revisit if needed. What drew you to Murshidabad painting specifically? Were there any findings that surprised you or even shocked you during this process of research? And finally, as a researcher, how were you able to balance the biases that are created with the process like this?
Okay, to your first question, so my initial training has been in history. So my specialization was medieval. I was very interested in the 18th century debate of this decline and the revisionist debate, and I found the 18th century a very interesting time of a lot, which was politically very fluid, naturally initiating a lot of social and cultural changes which were taking place during that time because of the many political agents which became important and significant. And painting during such periods of flux are usually quite interesting. Um, Obviously, we know the Battle of Plassey happened in Bengal, and the entire political shift of the subcontinent starts from Bengal, and there was a court in Bengal. So that was the question which drove me to understand. So, if there is a court, and if they are following the Mughal tradition, there must be paintings associated with the court. That was the driving question which brought me to Murshidabad painting. I must admit, when I started out, I had no idea of the corpus of work that were actually Murshidabad, because what we started out in the very early part of the conversation, a lot of them are mislabeled as provincial Mughal or company paintings without properly understanding the provenance of it. So
Yeah,
when I had started out, I just knew of a few paintings at the VNA's collection and one illustrated manuscript that I knew to be Murshidabad. But then when I started delving deeper into the matter, when I started looking into more things, I started looking into different styles, different patrons. I alongside I was also looking into the textual archive to situate my visual materials. I realized that the corpus of Murshidabad painting is huge, and no one really has looked at it in a very comprehensive or wholesome manner. And the best way to kind of address this was through these different strands of patronage, which were all all happening contemporaneously in 18 early 19th century. So that is how that was the driving question, and that is how I came to kind of um, discover actually all of these materials which were there but remained neglected from the larger academic discourse for most part.
yeah, for
Mm.
sure. Like, I'm so glad that you were able to get into this because now we have some documentation as well and some research on it, which is fantastic.
And for your second question about what shocked me or the discovery, what discoveries actually I think what shocked me is the amount of stuff that is actually Murshidabad and has never been understood as Murshidabad. This comes with understanding the different patrons. For example, no one has ever looked into the Jain patronage of painting, which is actually quite significant and quite major in Murshidabad painting, since the canon was always limited to that of the court. People have not, and then it kind of directly the gaze moves over to company painting. So everything else gets lost in this entire transition. So I think my biggest discoveries have been studying these albums which belong to different Europeans and not just English patrons, because I also do look into French patronage, which was quite vital at this point in time, and also sub-imperial patronage, because there were courtiers in the Murshidabad fort who were also kind of commissioning similar albums, and they were also commissioning similar illustrated manuscripts like the poets were doing, and the more localized kind of production like the scroll. So I think that was my biggest challenge and my biggest discovery, is to find all these different strands of painting all operating uh, side by side during this period. And so I absolutely, there's no question of a decline of art patronage during this time.
Yeah, I think you've you've summed it up really well, actually. And now I'm going to open this up to the audience as well. And I was just told that all the people watching this on YouTube can drop their comments in the live chat there, and we'll answer them here. But we also have a couple of questions right off the bat, which are open in front of me, and I'm just going to read it out to you, and I'll let you take them. Um, so someone said that they wanted to highlight the role of the art collectors, as it was first recognized by P.C. Manuk as well, who was an art collector himself. And he would also collect with other Mughal and Rajasthani paintings, which went on to influencing Mildred Archer as well, if I'm reading this right. And now many art collectors in the Patna region, either Khurda, Baksh, or the Jalans, they were also collecting this so-called Patna Kalam, taking pride in the historical legacy of it. One of the collectors in Patna refuses to drop the idea of problematizing the term company, as this makes the paintings more historical. This recollection now by the Indians, does that in any way subvert the gaze, which was more, I was more, I think it's accidental, or was it or does it increase the gap further? Sorry, it's a very long question.
I think I get the basic idea of the question. So obviously the coinage comes at a time which is 1940s, at the precipice of the Indian independence. It's happening from a westernized point of view. It's being done by Mildred Archer. Also, it's very important to situate Mildred Archer here. Why Patna Kalam? Is because Mildred Archer and her husband W.G. Archer were actually posted in Patna.
Yeah.
So she got access to the material from PC Manu, and she met this one of the last living Patna painters called Ishwari Prasad, um, which gave her the idea that the company paintings and Patna Kalam were one and the same. And obviously, she being a British woman, and most of this collection then going into the British Library, I think it's a very natural, it very naturally follows that she would call this company painting, meaning English East India Company painting. So, however, while we problematize the use of this term, it also has a historiographical purpose to serve in the understanding of Indian paintings, to which we have to take into consideration. Now, obviously, with all the new kind of strands of painting and the different patrons, we have to problematize the use of this overarching term. So I don't think we can call this particularly subversive, but we can call this as a revision, which it's a taxonomy. It's a taxon which has been used, which the libraries, collections, museums have used for the past 60, 70 years, for which there has also been a lot of misclassification of paintings, which we need to nuance now that we know more about the different patrons and the different styles which were all concurrent to one another. So
Yeah.
I,
So
I think
yeah.
uh, that answers the question. I lost the track of the question. It was
Yeah, it was a very long question.
but yeah, but then also to add another point, um, in this debate of company painting, uh, Mildred Archer, being British, calls this company, meaning English is still a company. But if we look into the French scholarship, there were scholars like Jean-Marie Lafont who calls this as a Firangi painting and calls it as a French company painting. So obviously everyone is talking from their perspective, and while it is important to understand the distinction between this different European companies and how they were interacting, um, it is that is why we have to unpack this term, because the French would call this French company painting, the British will call this company painting. And since the British art historiography has largely dominated Indian art historical studies, we tend to use it more often than the others.
Yeah, which is also interesting because when we were looking at like resources for the exhibition as well, it was Ishwari Prasad who first referred to it as the company column.
Yeah,
And just the usage of the word itself within that context was so fascinating.
yeah.
Um, so we have another question by Manmohan who says, can we please see more mica paintings in the few shown? You should come check out our exhibition here at the museum. We have more than 85 on display. And then we have a last final question, which delves into the idea of the other in the 18th century specifically, and how different figures were typically depicted by artists. Because we came across one which is referred to here as well, which is that your different European officers were depicted in caricature forms almost. We have one in the exhibition as well, which is it's probably a Dutch officer. And then it's followed by photography in India as well. And that idea was taken to the next level by this transition as well. And the question is, could you shed some light on it?
So this was obviously a time when the company was trying to lay its groundwork for the expansion of the empire. This was also a time of knowledge gathering, and a lot of these commissions were very encyclopedic in nature. Uh, they they were these were foreign to them, the people, the place, the flora, the fauna, and they wanted to gather as much knowledge about it as they could. And the result of it can be seen in company paintings in the form of class, caste, and professional paintings. So they are trying to classify and categorize Indian people into different classes, castes, and professions. It can be seen in the zoological and the botanical drawings, which are we find plenty examples in company paintings. That is also happening because of the kind of knowledge gathering exercise that this initial early company officers are doing. So obviously there is a question of otherization, and there is this entire notion of knowledge gathering such that they know more, which will help them to kind of be able to penetrate the society, be able to influence the people in a much more pervasive way in this time when they were. And this was happening across. This was happening in terms of um, textual studies. This was happening in collecting visual materials. There were maps that were being commissioned. So this is a period of huge knowledge gathering, and all of these were part of that process. And eventually it would be followed, like you said, with photography. And we have things like People of India series, which kind of categorizes all of these in photographic medium. So the paintings, the company paintings, the class profession, and these paintings can be seen as a precursor to the photographic medium of, say, People of India.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we also try to do through the exhibition, which kind of brings us to the end of this session. We've sorted out all the questions, and I just want to say a big thank you to you, Mrinalini, for joining us today and for really sharing your knowledge and for just being so gracious with your time as well. It's been a real pleasure interacting with you and really looking forward to doing many more of these well into the future as well.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I wish I could have come to visit the exhibition, but since it's a very short time, uh, I'm based out of Amsterdam. I'm just here for a fieldwork in India, and I could not cram in a visit to Bangalore to see the exhibition. I wish I could have seen it. It would have been really lovely because mica exhibitions, I do not know of mica exhibitions which has opened either abroad or here, a wholesome exhibition. So it would have been lovely to see them. But I'm going to.
No, we can always sort that out over video call.
Great. Thank
But again, thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining today. And if you haven't yet seen the exhibition, it's on display at Map Bangalore, and it is on until the 23rd of February.
Thank you.